and enforce what appears to be the new normal. Thank you, Dame Maria. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I too would like to thank the 116,000 members of the public who signed this public petition so that we can have this important debate today. And I'd also like to thank Dr. David Bell, someone who actually has worked for a long number of years for the WHO, for his briefings to me, and also to the Swiss lawyer Philipp Kruse for his contributions to my information today. And I would like to start by agreeing with the Honourable Member for Shipley, who we both spoke in the public petition debate on the 17th of April earlier this year, where we considered the pandemic treaty. It is impossible to consider either the pandemic treaty or the amendments to the international health regulations in isolation. They are two linked instruments of the WHO, and they need to be considered in parallel. And my opening question, is why does the WHO make false claims regarding proposals to seize states' sovereignty? Dame Maria, the Director General of the WHO has stated that no country will cede sovereignty to the WHO, referring to the WHO's new pandemic agreement and the proposed amendments to the international health regulations currently being negotiated. His statements are clear and unequivocal, and also wholly inconsistent with the text he's referring to. And I would remind the Chamber that this is the unelected, unaccountable, non-tax-paying, immune from prosecution due to diplomatic immunity Director General of the WHO, and that all employees of the United Nations and the WHO enjoy these particular perks. Any rational examination of the text in question show that the documents propose a transfer of decision-making power to the WHO regarding basic aspects of societal function which countries undertake to enact. The WHO Director General will have the sole authority to decide when and where they're applied, and the proposals are intended to be binding under international law. Continued claims that sovereignty is not lost, echoed by politicians in this House and other elected assemblies, and of course the media, therefore raise very important questions concerning motivations, competence and indeed ethics. The intent of the text is a transfer of decision-making currently vested in nations and individuals to the WHO. When its Director General decides that there is a threat of a significant disease outbreak or other health emergency likely to cross multiple national borders, it is very unusual for nations to undertake to follow external entities regarding the basic rights and healthcare of their citizens, more so when this has a major economic and geopolitical implication. The question of whether sovereignty is indeed being transferred and the legal status of such an agreement is therefore of vital importance, particularly to legislators of democratic states such as ourselves. We have an absolute duty to be sure of our ground, and I systematically examine that ground here today. So amending the 2005 International Health Regulations may be a straightforward way to quickly deploy and enforce what appears to be the new normal for health control measures that we've seen implemented since COVID-19 pandemic. The current text applies to virtually the entire global population, counting 196 states, including all 194 WHO member states. Approval may or may not be required by a formal vote of the World Health Assembly, as the recent 2022 amendment was adopted through consensus. If the same approval mechanism is to be used in May 2024, many countries, and indeed the public, may remain unaware of the broad scope of the new text and its implications to national and individual sovereignty. This is why today's debate is so important. The IHR sets recommendations under a treaty process that has force currently under international law. They seek to provide the WHO with some moral authority to coordinate and lead responses when an international health emergency, such as a pandemic, occurs. Currently, most are non-binding, and these contain very specific examples of measures that the WHO can currently recommend, including in the Article 18. They can require medical examinations, they can review proof of vaccination or other prophylaxis, require vaccination or other prophylaxis, place suspect persons under public health observation, implement quarantine or other health measures for suspect persons, implement isolation and treatment where necessary of affected persons, implement tracing of contacts of suspected or affected persons, refuse entry of suspect or affected persons, refuse entry of unaffected persons to affected areas, and implement exit screening and or restrictions on persons from affected areas. These measures, when implemented together, are generally referred to, since 2020, as lockdowns and mandates. Lockdown was previously a term reserved for people incarcerated as criminals, and it removes basic universally accepted human rights, such as measures that were previously considered by the WHO themselves to be detrimental to public health. However, ever since 2020, it has become the default standard for public health authorities to manage epidemics, despite its contradictions to multiple stipulations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. And I will remind the Chamber of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, including no arbitrary detention under Article 9. No one should be subjected to arbitrary interference with his or her private family, home or correspondence, protected under Article 12. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country under Article 13. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers, under Article 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association under Article 20. The will of the people shall be the basis of authority of government, Article 21. Everyone has the right to work, Article 23. Everyone has the right to education, Article 26. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realised, Article 28. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying any state, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein in Article 30. Under these UDHR stipulations, they are the basis of the modern concept of individual sovereignty and the relationship between the authorities and their populations, considered the highest codification of the rights and freedoms of individuals in the 20th century. Dame Maria, they may soon be dismantled behind closed doors in a meeting room in Geneva. The proposed amendments will change the recommendations and the current documentation required through these three mechanisms, removing the term non-binding, as we've already heard from the Honourable Member for Shipley in Article 1, inserting the phrase, the Member States will undertake to follow WHO recommendations and recognise WHO not as an organisation under the control of countries, but as the coordinating authority under new Article 13A. States parties recognise WHO as the guidance and coordinating authority of international public health response during the public health emergencies of international concern and undertake to follow WHO recommendations in their international public health response. As Article 18 makes clear above, these include multiple actions directly restricting individual liberty. If the transfer of decision-making power, sovereignty, is not intended here, then the current status of the IHR as recommendations could remain, and countries would not be undertaking to follow the WHO's recommendations. State parties undertake to enact what previously were merely recommendations without delay, including requirements of WHO regarding non-state entities under their jurisdiction in Article 42. Health measures taken pursuant to these regulations, including the recommendations made under Articles 15 and 16, shall be initiated and completed without delay by all state parties and applied in a transparent, equitable and non-discriminatory manner. State parties shall also take measures to ensure non-state actors operating within their respective territories comply with such measures. Non-state actors, that's private businesses, that's charities, that's individuals. In other words, everyone and everything comes under the control of the WHO once the Director General declares a public health emergency of international concern. Articles 15 and 16 mentioned here allow the WHO to require a state to provide resources, health products, technologies and know-how, and to allow the WHO to deploy personnel into the country, i.e. they'll have control over entry across national borders for whoever they choose. They also repeat the requirement for the country to require the implementation of medical countermeasures, e.g. testing, vaccines, quarantine on their population where the WHO demands it. Of note, the proposed Article 1 amendment removing the non-binding is actually redundant if new Article 13A and or the changes to Article 42 remain in place. This can and likely will be removed in the final text, giving the appearance of a compromise without actually changing the thrust of the transfer of the sovereignty because of the two other clauses. All of the public health measures in Article 18 and additional ones such as limiting freedom of speech to reduce public exposure to alternative viewpoints, Annex 1, new Article 5E, counter misinformation and disinformation, clash directly with the UDHR, although freedom of speech is currently exclusively for national authorities to decide, and its restriction is genuinely seen as negative and abusive. United Nations institutions, including the WHO, have been advocating for censoring unofficial views in order to protect the people from what they call information integrity. No doubt, Dame Maria, if these amendments were in place, I would probably not be allowed to give this speech today, and if I was, it would never be allowed to be reported in the mainstream media or even on social media. So it seems outrageous from a human rights perspective that the amendments will enable the WHO to dictate to countries to require individual medical examinations and vaccinations whenever it declares a pandemic, while the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki refer specifically to human experimentation, e.g. clinical trials and vaccines, and the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights also to provide a patient relationship. They can reasonably be extended to public health measures that impose restrictions or changes to human behaviour, and specifically to any measures requiring injection, medication or medical examination which involve a direct provider-person interaction. If vaccines or drugs are still under trial and not fully tested, then the issue of being subject to an experiment is also real. There's a very clear intent to employ the CEPI 100-day, that's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation's 100-day vaccine programme, which by definition cannot complete meaningful safety and efficacy trials within the time span. As we know from the COVID-19 vaccines, they're still experimental, years on from their first introduction, because they're still under emergency use authorisation. So forced examination or medication outside of a situation where the recipient is clearly not mentally competent to comply or reject when provided with the information is unethical. Requiring compliance in order to assess what are considered basic human rights under the UDHR would constitute coercion. If this does not fit with the WHO's definition of infringement of individual sovereignty on national sovereignty, then the Director General and his supporters need to publicly explain what definition of sovereignty they're using. The proposed pandemic agreement will set humanity in a new era, strangely organised around pandemics, pre-pandemic, pandemic and inter-pandemic times. A new governance structure under WHO auspices will oversee the IHR amendments and related initiatives. It will rely on a new funding requirement, including the WHO's ability to demand additional funding and materials from countries and to run a supply network to support its work in health emergencies. That's under Article 12. In the event of a pandemic, real-time access by WHO to a minimum of 20%, 10% as a donation and 10% at affordable prices to WHO, of the production of safe, efficacious and effective pandemic-related products for distribution based on public health risks and needs, and the understanding that each party that has manufacturing facilities that produce pandemic-related products in its jurisdictions shall take all necessary steps to facilitate the export of such pandemic-related products in accordance with timetables to be agreed between WHO and manufacturers. And in Article 20, in brackets 1, provide support and assistance to other parties upon request to facilitate the containment of spillover at the source. The entire structure will be financed by a new funding stream, separate from current WHO funding, an additional requirement on taxpayers over current national commitments, which is Article 20 in brackets 2. The funding also will include an endowment of voluntary contributions of all relevant sectors that benefit from international work to strengthen pandemic preparation, preparedness and response, and donations from philanthropic organisations. I wonder who they might be. Article 22b, perhaps someone who made a lot of money out of mRNA vaccination. Madame Maria, this is taxation without representation. Currently, countries decide on their level of foreign aid on the basis of national priorities, apart from limited funding that they may have already agreed to allocate to organisations such as the WHO under existing obligations or treaties. The proposed agreement is remarkable, not in just it's greatly increased the amount of countries must give as part of treaty requirements, but in setting up a parallel funding structure disconnected from other disease priorities, quite the opposite of previous ideas on integrated health policy. It also gives power to external groups, not directly accountable, to demand or acquire further resources whenever they deem necessary. In a further encroachment into what is normally within the legal jurisdiction of nation states, the agreement will require countries to establish, under Article 15, no-fault vaccine injury compensation mechanisms, consecrating effective immunity for pharmaceutical companies for harm to citizens resulting from their products that the WHO recommends under an emergency use authorisation. That's going to be embedded. That is going to be the norm, or indeed requires countries to mandate on their citizens. As is becoming increasingly acceptable for those in power, ratifying countries will agree to limit the right of their public to voice opposition to the WHO's measures and claims regarding such an emergency under Article 18, to, as I quote, and combat false, misleading, misinformation or disinformation, including through effective international collaboration and cooperation. As we've seen during COVID-19, the 1919 response, the definition of misleading information can be dependent on political or commercial expediency, including factual information on vaccine efficacy and safety and orthodox immunology that would impair the sale of health commodities. This is why open democracies put such emphasis on defending free speech, Chair, even at the risk of sometimes being misleading. In signing on to this agreement, governments will be agreeing to abrogate that principle regarding their own citizens when instructed to do so by the WHO. The scope of this proposed agreement and the IHR amendments is broader than pandemics, greatly expanding the scope under which a transfer of decision-making powers can be demanded by the WHO. Other environmental threats to health, such as changes in climate, can be declared emergencies at the DG's discretion in broad definitions of a One Health, if broad definitions of a One Health policy are adopted and recommended. It's difficult to think of another international instrument where such powers over national resources are passed on to an unelected external organisation. It's even more challenging to envisage how this is seen as anything other than a loss of sovereignty. The only justification for this claim would appear to be if the draft agreement is to be signed on the basis of deceit, and that there's no intention for us to treat it in any other way than an irrelevant piece of paper, or something that would only apply to perhaps to less powerful states than the United Kingdom, perhaps a colonialist tool. And I've spoken at length to elected representatives in Africa and urged them to urge their elected assemblies to reject this power grab by the unelected, unaccountable WHO. So both texts are intended to be legally binding. The IHR already has such status. So the impact of the proposed changes on the need for the new acceptance by countries are complicated national jurisdictional issues. There is a current mechanism for rejection of the new amendments. However, unless a high number of countries will actively voice their opposition and rejections, the adoption of the current published version dated February 2023 will likely lead to a future shadowed by the permanent risks of the WHO lockdown and lockstep diktats. The proposed pandemic agreement is also clearly intended to be legally binding. WHO discusses this issue, and it's been supported by the INB and various declarations of the G20. The IHR, as we say, already has standing under international law, while seeking such status, the WHO officials who previously described the proposed agreement as a treaty are now insisting that neither instrument impacts sovereignty. The implication is that states' representatives at the World Health Assembly that will agree the transfer, not the WHO itself, as if that makes any difference to our loss of sovereignty from the UK. The WHO's position raises a real question of whether its leadership is truly ignorant of what's being proposed, or is actively seeking to mislead countries and the public in order to increase the probability of acceptance. The latest version, dated 30th of October 2023, requires 40 ratifications for the future agreement to enter into force after a two-thirds vote in favour within the WHO, the World Health Assembly. Opposition by a considerable number of countries will therefore be needed to derail this project, as it's backed by powerful governments and institutions, financial mechanisms including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and bilateral aids. They're likely to make opposition by lower income countries extremely difficult to sustain. So much of the world, Dame Maria, is looking to our Parliament to step up to the plate and protect democracy around the world. So the relevant question regarding these two WHO instruments should really be not whether sovereignty is threatened, but why any sovereignty would be forfeit by democratic states to an organisation that is significantly funded and bound to obey the dictates of corporations and self-proclaimed philanthropists, and jointly governed by member states, half of which are not even open and transparent democracies. So why would we do this? If it is indeed true that sovereignty is being knowingly forfeited by governments without the knowledge and consent of their peoples and based on false claims by governments and the WHO, then the implications are extremely serious. It would imply that leaders are working directly against the interest of their people. Most countries do have specific fundamental laws for dealing with this practice, so it's really important for those defending these projects to either explain their definitions of sovereignty and democratic process, or explicitly seek informed public consent. The other question to be asked is why public health authorities and media are repeating the WHO's assurances of the benign nature of the pandemic instruments. It asserts that claims of reduced sovereignty are misinformation or disinformation, which they assert elsewhere are major killers of mankind, while such claims are somewhat ludicrous and appear intended to denigrate the dissenters, such as myself. The WHO is clearly guilty of the very crime of which it accuses others. If its leadership cannot demonstrate how it claims regarding these pandemic instruments they're not deliberately misleading, its leadership should appear ethically compelled to resign from their positions, and we should defund them. The WHO lists three major pandemics in the last century: influenza outbreaks in late 1960s, 50s, 60s, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The first two killed less than die each year from tuberculosis, whilst the reported deaths from COVID-19 never reached the level of cancer or cardiovascular disease and remain almost irrelevant in low-income countries compared to endemic infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. Putting the pandemics in perspective, no other non-influenza outbreak recorded by the WHO that fits the definition of a pandemic, e.g. rapid spread across international borders for a limited time with a pathogen not normally causing significant harm, has caused greater mortality in total than a few days of tuberculosis. About 4,000 people a day die from that in the world, or more life years lost than a few days of malaria, which sadly kills 1,500 children under 5 every day. So if indeed it's the case that our government and our opposition parties and their supporters within the public health community consider that the powers currently vested within national jurisdictions should be given over to external bodies on the basis of this level of recorded harm, then it would be best that we have a public conversation as to whether this is sufficient basis for abandoning democratic ideals in favour of a more fascist and authoritarian approach. We are, after all, talking about restricting basic human rights essential for any democracy to function. Thank you.